All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. And today we're going to tackle a huge turning point in history, the dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy right around the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah, and we got a great source here to help us unpack it all.
Oh, yeah.
An excerpt from U.S. Foreign Affairs Shift. And this is going to be fascinating, whether you're prepping for a history discussion or just curious about how America went from kind of sitting on the sidelines to being a major player on the world stage. So
It is really interesting to see that transformation, like you said, from hesitant to engaged to really being right there in the thick of things.
yeah, exactly. And before 1900, the name of the game was isolationism. But as the source points out, it wasn't complete isolation.
Right, not at all.
It was more like the U.S. dipping its toes in the water of global affairs.
Yeah, like testing the waters a little bit.
Yeah. And if you think back to the 18th century, you had the American colonists getting pulled into conflicts like the 7 Years' War.
Right, fighting side by side with the British.
Yeah. And we even have that engraving the colonies reduced that really captures the tension even back then between the colonists and the British Crown.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a really important piece to consider, that tension.
Yeah, and then, of course, you have the Mexican-American War in 1846, which was primarily a land dispute, but it did expand U.S. territory.
It did, even though the focus was still largely, North America.
Right. Still pretty focused on their own backyard.
Exactly. And yet, when you look at things like what was happening in Hungary and Poland in the 1800s, they had their struggles for independence.
Right.
And there were these calls for the U.S. to step in, but the government held back.
They stayed out of it.
Yeah, really illustrating that they were committed to this idea of not getting too involved on the world stage.
So if there were already these, moments where the U.S. was getting involved, what really changed after 1900? What made them decide to become more assertive internationally?
Well, the source points to a few key factors. The Spanish-American War in 1898 is definitely a turning point. It really showcased U.S. military strength, and it also marked a shift towards promoting American ideals abroad.
That's a good point, because that's the war that led to them acquiring territories like Puerto Rico and Guam, right?
Exactly. Significantly expanding their influence, no doubt.
And it makes you wonder if they were, kind of following the trends of the times.
Oh, interesting.
This was the age of imperialism.
It was.
You had European powers building empires left and right.
That's right.
So did that put pressure on the U.S. to keep up and stake their own claim?
It's definitely a valid question, because when you look at the whole global power dynamic at the time, everybody's scrambling for colonies and resources, right?
Yeah.
So you could definitely argue that that influenced U.S. ambitions.
Makes sense.
They saw what was happening and maybe felt like they needed to assert themselves to protect their own interests.
Right. And then, of course, you have World War I breaking out in 1914. And even though the U.S. stayed neutral at first, by 1917, they joined the war to support their allies.
That's right.
That's a huge departure from the isolationist stance, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Joining World War I really signaled that the U.S. was recognizing how interconnected global affairs were and how they could impact U.S. interests.
Right, even if those affairs were happening across an ocean.
Exactly. It was a clear move away from that non-intervention policy they'd held for so long.
So how do we make sense of this whole period after 1900? It seems like it wasn't just a straight line from isolationism to interventionism, right?
No, not at all.
There's got to be more to it.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Okay.
The source actually breaks it down into distinct phases of U.S. foreign policy after 1900, each with its own kind of characteristics and driving forces.
Well, that's interesting. So it's more of a, a winding road than a straight shot.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, let's break down those phases then. The first one, the source highlights, is 1899 to 1913, and it's labeled Defending U.S. International Interests.
Right.
Which seems to be about protecting those growing global interests that we've been talking about. So what are some examples of how that played out in practice?
Well, a great example is the open door policy in China.
Okay.
This was all about ensuring U.S. businesses had access to Chinese markets.
Interesting.
And then you have the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Latin American affairs if they felt it was necessary.
Hold on. So let's back up for a second.
Sure.
That Roosevelt corollary, maybe some of our listeners aren't totally familiar with the details.
Yeah, good point.
It was basically an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which had warned European powers to stay out of the Americas, right?
Exactly. It said, hey, this is our backyard, hands off.
Right. But the Roosevelt corollary took it a step further and said the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin America to prevent European intervention.
It did, essentially claiming a sphere of influence in the region.
So it was about keeping other powers out,
Yeah.
but also about justifying U.S. action in the region.
Yeah, which you can see how that could be controversial, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It potentially laid the groundwork for a lot of future interventions in Latin
It
America.
definitely sets a precedent.
Definitely does. And it had a lasting impact on U.S.-Latin American relations, something worth exploring more deeply for sure.
Yeah, especially because it connects to those debates about U.S. interventionism even today.
Oh, absolutely. Still relevant.
And speaking of interventionism, the next phase the source outlines is from 1914 to 1920, and it focuses on World War I and what they call Wilsonian diplomacy.
Right. That's a big one.
And this refers to President Woodrow Wilson's efforts to promote peace and democracy globally, right?
Yeah, exactly. Wilsonian idealism, as it's often called, was really a big shift from the way international relations had been conducted for centuries.
Okay, so we have realism and idealism as these two key concepts emerging here.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
Can you give us a quick breakdown for our listeners?
Sure. Think of them as like two different lenses to view a nation's actions on the world stage through.
Right.
Realism emphasizes a nation acting in its own self-interest. It's all about pursuing power and security above everything else. It's very pragmatic.
So it's kind of like a survival of the fittest mentality in international relations.
Yeah, in a way, it's about doing what's best for your nation, regardless of whether it's, morally right or wrong.
Got it.
Now, idealism, on the other hand, emphasizes international cooperation.
Yeah.
It's about ethical considerations and working towards a more just and peaceful world.
So it's more about nations working together for the common good.
Exactly, promoting things like democracy and human rights.
It sounds like U.S. foreign policy after 1900 was trying to navigate these two approaches, sometimes leaning more toward realism, other times towards idealism.
Absolutely. It's a tension that still exists in U.S. foreign policy even today.
Wow. So much to think about already, and we're just getting started.
We are. There's so much more to uncover.
Well, folks, you're in for a treat. This deep dive is just getting warmed up.
It is. Buckle up.
We're going to take you on a wild ride through history.
Absolutely.
Just stay tuned. We'll be right back after a quick break.
And as we move through the 20th century, you see that tension playing out, in things like the Cold War and all those regional conflicts the U.S. got involved in.
Right.
The trend towards being involved globally continues, but the motivations are always this mix of idealistic goals and, hard-nosed realism.
Yeah, it's never simple, is it?
Not at all.
And it's really striking when you look at that table in the source comparing U.S. foreign policy before and after 1900. It's like night and day.
It really is a huge contrast.
Just like looking at two totally different countries.
You go from isolationism to interventionism, military actions going from continental defense to overseas engagements.
A complete 180.
It is. The U.S. goes from a relatively minor player to a major world power-shaping global events.
And we see a shift from avoiding alliances to actively forming them like NATO, which is still so important today.
Oh, yeah. Hugely important.
And then the economic sphere explodes. It's not just about North America anymore. The U.S. is a global economic force.
Right. It's a complete transformation. And the source really emphasizes how these key historical events solidify this new role for the U.S.
Okay, so which events are we talking about specifically?
Well, you've got the Spanish-American War, World War I, the Cold War, and even the creation of the United Nations in 1945.
Right, these aren't just events. They're like markers of how deeply the U.S. is now involved in, the fate of the world.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how decisions made over a century ago can have, consequences we're still dealing with today.
It's true.
Speaking of those long-term consequences, the source also talks about how U.S. economic power really comes into play during this period.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's not just about military might.
Right.
As the U.S. becomes this economic powerhouse through trade and loans, they gain a whole new level of influence.
So it's like financial clout translates into real leverage on the world stage.
Exactly. It's a tool of foreign policy just as powerful as any military action.
So in a way, it's about shaping the world not just through force, but through economic power.
Precisely, they could use their economic strength to encourage certain policies or to, forge alliances, even to sway the outcomes of disputes between other nations.
It's like a subtler form of influence.
Yeah, but incredibly effective.
And while all this is happening globally, the U.S. is also going through these huge internal changes.
Right.
The source mentions population growth and industrialization.
Yeah.
So how do those domestic factors play into this shift in foreign policy?
Well, that's a question that often gets overlooked as the U.S. population grows and their industries boom. The demand for resources and markets grows too.
Yeah, they need more raw materials for those factories and new customers to buy all the stuff they're producing.
Exactly. It's like this internal engine pushing them to look outward.
Right. They need solutions and opportunities, and they start looking globally.
Precisely. And that's where those global ambitions come in the need for resources, and markets pushes them to engage more actively with the rest of the world.
And it's not just about resources and markets, though, right? The source also mentions this idea of promoting American ideals abroad, like democracy and human rights.
That's right. It's like this moral dimension gets added to their foreign policy.
So it's not just about America first, but also about shaping the world and America's image, at least in terms of those ideals.
You could say that, and that interplay between national interest and promoting certain values is still a big factor in U.S. foreign policy today.
It's a balancing act for sure.
It is, and the approach shifts depending on, the situation and who's in charge.
Okay, let's step back for a second and think about the long-term consequences of this shift.
Mhm.
The U.S. goes from being this cautious observer to a leading actor on the world stage. How does this impact the course of events throughout the 20th century?
Well, you can draw a direct line from this shift to things like World War II.
Yeah.
The U.S. might have been hesitant to get involved at first, but they played a decisive role in defeating the Axis powers.
And that really solidified their position as a global superpower.
Oh, absolutely.
And then, of course, you have the Cold War, this decades-long struggle with the Soviet Union.
Right.
That must have further cemented the U.S. role as a global leader.
For sure, the Cold War forced the U.S. to engage in this global contest for influence, leading to things like NATO and, interventions in various parts of the world.
It was all about containing communism.
Exactly.
I've heard some historians refer to the U.S. as the world's policeman during this period. Do you think that's an accurate characterization?
I mean, it's a simplification, of course, but it does capture a certain truth about their role during the Cold War. There was this sense that they were responsible for maintaining order and stability, for defending democracy and freedom against communism.
But that role wasn't without its controversies, was it?
Not at all. There were definitely criticisms about U.S. interventionism, accusations of imperialism, concerns about them overstepping their boundaries.
It sounds like a really tough balancing act, trying to promote their interests and ideals while also navigating this complex world where not everyone wants them to be the policeman.
It is a constant challenge, and one that the U.S. still grapples with today. How do you use your power responsibly? How do you balance your own interests with ethical considerations?
Right. Those are tough questions with no easy answers.
Exactly.
So we've traced this journey of U.S. foreign policy from isolation to global leadership.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there, does it?
No, it definitely doesn't.
How does this historical shift continue to shape the world we live in today?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The legacy of this transformation is all around us. You can see it in the global economy, in international institutions, in the debates about America's role in the world.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how those decisions made over a century ago are still impacting us today?
Sure, think about the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund. Those institutions were largely shaped by U.S. influence, reflecting their commitment to free trade and open markets.
And those military alliances like NATO, they're still crucial for global security today.
Right, they represent a continuation of that commitment to containing threats and maintaining a certain world order.
And what about those ongoing debates about U.S. interventionism?
Yeah, whether it's the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan or the situation in Ukraine, those arguments about the limits of American power and their responsibility to intervene are all directly tied to that shift we've been talking about.
It's amazing how it all connects.
It really is. It's like a ripple effect from those early decisions.
So while we've focused on this turning point around 1900, it's clear that the story of U.S. foreign policy is far from over.
Oh, yeah, it's still being written.
What are some of the key questions we should be asking as we look ahead?
Well, I think one of the biggest questions is how does the U.S. adapt its foreign policy to a world that's becoming more and more multipolar?
Okay.
The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, the growing influence of regional powers, all of that challenges the dominant role the U.S. has played for so long.
It's like we're at another turning point similar to the one we've been discussing where the U.S. needs to redefine its role and its approach to the world.
Exactly. The rules of the game are changing, and the U.S. needs to adapt if it wants to maintain its influence and, effectively address the challenges of the 21st century.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from isolationism to global leadership.
Yeah.
What are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, one crucial takeaway is that foreign policy is never static. It's always evolving in response to changing circumstances both domestically and internationally.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach. You have to be flexible.
Exactly. And that adaptation involves balancing competing priorities, national interest, moral values, economic considerations, security concerns.
Complicated.
There are rarely easy answers.
Another key insight, I think, is the importance of understanding the historical context. Those decisions made over a century ago weren't made in a vacuum.
Right. They were influenced by internal pressures, global power dynamics, specific events.
It's all connected.
It is. And that historical context is essential for understanding the world we live in today. Those patterns of engagement and intervention, those debates about American power and responsibility are all rooted in this history.
And it's a history that's still unfolding.
Mm-mm.
We've talked about realism and idealism as these competing forces shaping U.S. foreign policy. Do you think one approach is ultimately better than the other?
I don't think it's about choosing one over the other. It's about finding the right balance.
Okay.
A successful foreign policy needs to be both pragmatic, taking into account power and national interest, but also principled, upholding values and striving to make the world a better place.
It's like that old saying, walk softly and carry a big stick.
I like that.
Maybe the key is to be both strong and principled, to use your power wisely.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It's about combining strength with wisdom, understanding that every action has consequences, and striving to create a more just and peaceful world while also protecting your own interests.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive into this pivotal moment in U.S. foreign policy, but the conversation doesn't end here, right?
No, not at all. This is just the beginning.
Okay.
Understanding this historical shift is essential for grappling with the challenges and opportunities facing the U.S. in the 21st century.
And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
Yeah.
As you follow current events, as you engage in discussions about America's role in the world, remember this historical context.
It's crucial.
It's essential for understanding the forces that shape our world, the decisions that are made, and the consequences that, ripple across generations.
It's true. The story of U.S. foreign policy is still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping its future.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Hopefully our listeners are feeling inspired to continue exploring this topic and to engage in those critical conversations about America's role in the world.
It's been a pleasure diving into this fascinating subject with you.
Likewise, and to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. It feels like we just scratched the surface of this huge topic.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
I'm already thinking about like a million different directions we could go from here.
That's the thing about history. It just keeps giving you more questions the deeper you go.
It really does.
And U.S. foreign policy is so relevant today with all the global challenges we're facing. It's really all about cooperation and finding creative solutions.
Right. It's more important than ever.
Absolutely.
So before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's bring it back to our listeners.
Yeah.
What are some things they can do to, keep exploring this topic? What resources would you recommend?
Well, the source we've been talking about, U.S. Foreign Affairs Shift, is a great starting point.
Right.
It gives you a good overview, but I'd also recommend checking out some of the work by historians who really focus on this period.
Yeah.
There are some really amazing books and articles that dive deeper into specific aspects of U.S. foreign policy.
And don't forget about primary sources.
Oh, yeah, those are gold.
Reading firsthand accounts from people who actually lived through these events can really bring history to life.
It's like stepping back in time.
Exactly. Letters, diaries, speeches, they give you a perspective you don't always get from textbooks.
Absolutely. And for anyone who prefers something more visual, documentaries and historical films can be a great way to learn.
Right.
Just remember to watch them with a critical eye,
Yeah.
But keep in mind they often present a particular interpretation of events.
It's like that line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the legend becomes fact print the legend.
I like that.
We got to remember that history is often told from a specific viewpoint, and it's up to us to, dig a little deeper and question those narratives.
Absolutely. And that's especially important when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, which has often been presented, in a very positive light.
Right.
It's crucial to look at the whole picture, acknowledge the complexities, the controversies, understand how U.S. actions impacted people, both here and in other countries.
So it's not just about memorizing facts, it's about developing those critical thinking skills.
Right.
Being able to analyze different perspectives and come to your own conclusions.
Exactly. And that's a skill that's essential for everything, not just history.
Yeah, navigating life in general.
It is. We're constantly bombarded with information these days, and it's more important than ever to be able to filter through it all.
To figure out what's real and what's not.
Exactly, to identify biases and form your own informed opinions.
It's like we've come full circle back to this idea of a deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about passively listening.
Right.
It's about actively engaging with the information.
Asking those tough questions.
Yeah, and challenging our own assumptions.
That's what makes it so interesting.
It really does.
It's not just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and how we can use that knowledge to make things better.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Time flies.
It really does. Hopefully our listeners are feeling inspired to, keep learning about this topic and to have those important conversations about America's role in the world.
I hope so too.
Yeah, that's a conversation that needs to happen.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been a pleasure diving into this fascinating subject with you.
I've really enjoyed it.
Likewise, and to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.